It's Friday, the 9th of December. This is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. This week, Rishi Sunak faces questions about his authority.
His backbenchers threatened him. And as always, the blancmange Prime Minister wobbled.
As ever, engaging in the petty personality politics. Not focused on the substance.
The government decides that this coal mine in Cumbria can go ahead.
I have one question for the Secretary of State today. What on earth is he thinking?
Some of those who are complaining today are the first to complain about not doing enough for poorer regions of this country.
MPs debate the government's plan to regulate technology companies, but is it tough enough?
Platforms will still have to shield children and young people from both illegal content and a whole range of other harmful content.
This is not going to be robust enough regulation to deal with the threat that these platforms present.
And an attempt to end the political stalemate in Northern Ireland fails.
We cannot be left to the mercy of the Tories in London, people who are dictating the priorities here, when they have no votes and no mandate here.
We say to the UK and the EU, the ball is in your court, the clock is ticking, get on with it.
Well, let's start right here in Westminster with Susan Hume. Hello, Susan. So in the run-up to PMQs this week, Rishi Sunak had to change his position on two quite big things, namely house building targets and then onshore wind. What happened?
Yeah, well, buckle up, because it was really a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all the political issues, all came up in Prime Minister's questions. As you say, Keir Starmer pressed the Prime Minister over those two changes of policy, the one on house building, over pressure from his own side, from people who didn't want those quotas of numbers of houses to be built, particularly in the southeast, saying that it would spoil the area, and also on onshore wind. However, Keir Starmer was also quite keen to move on to the issue of how those COVID contracts were awarded. Lots of references there to Lady Moan, the Conservative peer. She's taken leave of absence from the House of Lords while all the furore is happening. Now, Rishi Sunak did address that, he did talk about it, but he was pretty keen to move on to yet another subject, to all those strikes that are coming up, to try and pressure Labour a bit on what they'd do about it.
The Conservative Party promised the country it would build 300,000 houses a year. This week, without asking a single voter, the Prime Minister broke that promise by scrapping mandatory targets. What changed?
We are protecting the Greenbelt. We are investing millions to develop brownfield sites. And we're providing support and protection for local neighbourhood plans. Just this morning, the Shadow Housing Secretary said, communities should have control over where homes are built and what sort of homes are built. That's my position, that's her position. What's his position?
Mr. Speaker, does he really expect us to believe that the member for Chipping Barton and the member for the Isle of Wight are cheering him on because he's going to build more homes? Pull the other one. I'll tell him what changed. His backbenchers threatened him. And as always, the blancmange Prime Minister wobbled. He did a grubby deal with a handful of his MPs and sold out the aspirations of those who want to own their own home. Was it worth it?
Mr. Speaker, as ever, engaging in the petty personality politics, not focused on the substance. Again, let me explain what we're doing. We're delivering what I said we would do. We're protecting the character of local communities. We're cracking down on land banking and irresponsible developers. And we're giving people a greater say in their decisions.
I noticed there was another U-turn last night, this time on wind farms. Actually, I agree with that one, but is there no issue on which he won't give in to his backbenchers? Now, Mr. Speaker, how did his colleague, Baroness Mone, end up with nearly £30 million of taxpayers' money in her bank account?
Mr. Speaker, let me say, like everyone else, I was absolutely shocked to read about the allegation. It's absolutely right. It's absolutely right that she is no longer attending the House of Lords and therefore no longer has the Conservative whip. Again, the one thing we know about the honourable gentleman, he is a lawyer. He should know there's a process in place. It's right that that process concludes. I hope that it's resolved promptly.
This morning, his Transport Secretary said that his flagship legislation on strikes, this is what he said this morning, his Transport Secretary, you might want to listen to this, is clearly not going to help with the industrial action we're facing. He should stop grandstanding, stop sitting on his hands, get round the table and resolve these issues.
Hard-working families right now in this country are facing challenges. The government has been reasonable. It's accepted the recommendations of an independent pay body, giving pay rises in many cases higher than the private sector. But if the union leaders to continue to be unreasonable, then it is my duty to take action to protect the lives and livelihoods of the British public.
We heard Keir Starmer there talking about some comments the Transport Secretary Mark Harper had made about this planned legislation around rail strikes. What did he actually say?
Well, he said that that legislation wouldn't actually help with this wave of strikes because there's no way it's going to become law before those kick in. And that's why Keir Starmer was suggesting that they wouldn't help, and the Prime Minister was really mentioning them to sound tough rather than doing something now about these strikes.
We also saw them discussing Baroness Mone and the allegations to do around PPE contracts during the COVID pandemic. Just talk us through the background to that.
OK, so a lot going on. The House of Lords had been carrying out an investigation into Lady Mone and whether she was involved in getting contracts for a firm called PPE MedPro. Now, that investigation has been put on ice while the National Crime Agency looks into the firm itself. Lady Mone herself, as I said earlier, has got leave of absence from the House of Lords in the meantime. And a spokesperson for her says her legal team is spending their time dealing with a witch hunt. That's how she puts it.
The question is very simple, Madam Deputy Speaker. What have ministers opposite got to hide? Yeah. Did they know all along who was behind the PPE MedPro? Or was due diligence so poor that they did not realise the problem? If they had nothing to hide and no rules or laws were broken, then ministers will surely be happy to make the details of the meetings and the correspondence available.
Colleagues will recall those early days. Planes turned around on the tarmac, countries imposing export bans, a huge inflation in global prices, and the price of crucial items like gloves increasing sixfold. Now, these were the conditions under which tough decisions were taken.
He does make, I think, the point which all of us would be well advised to try and remember, because it is now quite a long time ago, the absolute panic and fear. The whole world was trying to buy this stuff at any price that they could get hold of it.
With lives on the line, Madam Deputy Speaker, of course we had to change our approach to procurement and adjust our appetite for risk. And I don't believe, I will in a moment, but I don't believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, as my honourable friend just said, that the British people would have forgiven us if we'd stuck to the same old processes.
To add insult to injury, when the cargo of gowns finally arrived, a quick technical inspection from the National Health Service deemed them not fit for purpose, and they were never used. But I understand that this situation is so serious that the company is currently under investigation by the National Crime Agency. But inexplicably, up until a couple of hours ago, the peer involved was still operating under the Conservative Party whip. And as the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyme said, this stinks. We know it stinks, and the public...
Order. I'm quite sure that the honourable gentleman intends to talk about the process and the goods, etc., and that he will not be mentioning any peer in particular. And he said the peer involved, so it wasn't just peers in general, but a particular peer, and I'm sure that he doesn't want to make reference to any particular peer, but we'll just talk about the process.
It is particularly galling that we are seeing the former Health Secretary write a book on the pandemic diaries, and yet we are not able to scrutinise the facts and the evidence of the decisions that were taken, not just about the public's money, but also about the public's safety as well.
Recently, it was revealed, and I know we're not supposed to speak about the Conservative peer too much, but we do learn today that they're taking a leave of absence from the Lords. And I mean, I do hope, and I'm not saying this in jest, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I do hope that she's not on her yacht trying to do a runner.
And Labour were trying to squeeze some documents about this out of the government. Were they successful?
Yes, they were, actually, because the government didn't actually contest the vote. So, in fact, there wasn't a vote, it just went through. So the government is obliged now to disclose these documents about the contracts to PPE MedPro to the Public Accounts Committee. However, there's no deadline, and they say that all the investigations have to happen first, so don't expect them anytime soon, I don't think.
And this week we got a new party leader. It's Stephen Flynn, who's going to lead the group of SNP MPs in the House of Commons. And they're the third largest group of MPs in the House of Commons. And he made his debut at PMQs. He did. It's not just the Conservatives that can change a leader pretty quickly, because just the week before it was Ian Blackford who was asking the questions for the SNP. This week it was Ian Blackford sitting on the bench behind, and it was Stephen Flynn. They did have a nice handshake before it started, so no hard feelings, I'm sure.
Can I welcome the new leader of the SNP and thank Ian Blackford previously. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to begin by paying tribute to my friend and colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Ross Skye and Loch Aber, who has served us with diligence and duty for the last 5 years. Mr. Speaker, he is a giant of the Scottish independence movement. Mr. Speaker, he's seen off not one, not two, but 3 consecutive Tory Prime Ministers. Indeed, he was on to his 4th in recent weeks. And to that latest Prime Minister, I have a very simple question. What does he consider to be the greatest achievement of the Conservative Party in government since 2019? Leaving the single market and customs union, ending freedom of movement, denying Scotland her democracy, or getting the Labour Party to agree with all of the above?
Mr. Speaker, can I start by offering my genuine and warm, heartfelt best wishes to the Right Honourable Member for Ross Skye and Loch Aber. I know the whole House will miss his weekly contributions. And may I also congratulate or join the First Minister in congratulating the honourable gentleman on his appointment as a Westminster leader of the SNP. I look forward to a constructive debate with him across the dispatch box. Mr. Speaker, the answer to his question is actually very simple. The things that we are most proud of in the last couple of years is making sure that we protected this country through the pandemic with furlough and with the fastest vaccine rollout.
Susan, thank you very much. Right, now let's go to the Scottish Parliament and talk to our correspondent, Andrew Kerr. Hi, Andrew. And let's start with First Minister's questions, where Labour asked about mental health services for children. What happened?
Yes, that's right, Adam. We do hear a lot about problems in the health service. The Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, raised a number of issues, but the Labour leader honed in on mental health treatment, long referrals and rejected referrals, really concerned about those long waiting lists. Now, he gave the example of one primary school child called Charlie. He's about 11 years old. He had an online call with a doctor about 2 years ago, and he's not seen anyone since, and it might be another 2 years before he finally gets to speak to someone. And Mr. Sawar said that Charlie was struggling. Now, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, was sympathising with Charlie's plight, but Mr Sarwar was saying that children are being abandoned.
This government has never met its CAMHS waiting time, and according to Public Health Scotland, a quarter of all deaths of 5 to 24-year-olds in our country are from suicide. A quarter. In the words of Charlie's mum, our children are being failed and no one is doing anything about it. But we can fix this. So will the First Minister first reverse the cuts to mental health in primary care? Second, guarantee funding for schools-based counselling? Third, commit to increasing the proportion of the NHS budget being spent on mental health so it reaches 11%, the same level as England and Wales. Fourth, create a new referral and triage system for mental health so that no one is rejected. And finally, record and publish the true waiting time from referral to diagnosis and the start of treatment so that no child like Charlie is left abandoned.
Under this government, mental health spending has almost doubled in cash terms since we took office, and we will continue to support record expenditure across our National Health Service and ensure appropriate expenditure for mental health services. Of course, as I said earlier on, we are also shifting more treatment into the community. So one of the most important things that has been done, backed by investment, is the recruitment of counsellors across our secondary schools. These are really important issues, but issues again that, while it is right and proper to come to this chamber and state the challenge, our job, as I have demonstrated today, is to get on with the work of addressing these challenges. And as I have set out, we've seen a fall in the waiting list for access to CAMHS, and that's down to the investment and the actions that are being taken, and that's why it's so important that we continue with it.
So, Adam, every week we see similar issues being raised. The First Minister there saying she wants to get on with the work, and quite often she says the Scottish Health Service is outperforming compared to other health services in other parts of the UK.
Meanwhile, the Health Secretary, Hamza Yousaf, was asked about Strep A infections, which has been a big issue all across the UK. What did he say about that?
Yeah, that's right, Adam. Real concern about this, about Strep A. It has caused the death of a number of children across the UK. Now, this was raised earlier this week in the chamber here at Holyrood, and the Health Secretary was saying that despite some of these worries, there hasn't been a pronounced spike in infection, although the number of cases have gone up. Mr Yousaf was saying the vast majority of cases are mild and they can easily be treated by penicillin. But the Conservatives' health spokesperson, who's actually a GP as well, was raising issues about the state of the health service too. And he was saying that parents were worried about accessing advice when it came to this condition.
Symptoms for Strep A include a sandpaper-like rash, flu symptoms, so temperature over 38, sore throat, swollen glands, a strawberry red-looking tongue. I would urge people who have symptoms like this, especially in those children around under 10, to speak to their GP because antibiotics can very much help in these cases. Yesterday, in the House of Lords, the option of using antibiotics in schools as a preventative measure was raised when cases were present in that school. Are the Scottish Government actively considering prophylaxis?
Cabinet Secretary.
So again, I've asked Public Health Scotland and my clinical colleagues to give advice to that effect. What I would say is the levels of gas infection that we're seeing, and again, thankfully, of Group A strep that is not invasive, those cases are mild. We have seen, of course, the levels we've seen have not been or exceeded the peak levels that we've seen in previous years. Thankfully, we've not seen any deaths so far in Scotland, but we're not complacent. We do expect cases to rise over the coming weeks, and hence why I've asked clinicians to give advice about the very issue that Sandesh Gulhani has raised.
Now, later in the week, the Health Secretary said there was no shortage of antibiotics in Scotland, and next week, Adam, we have the first draft of the Scottish budget being published. It will be interesting to see just what funds the Scottish Government wants to allocate to the health service for the new financial year.
There was also a big report this week about the Scottish Government's record on tackling climate change, and this came from the official watchdog. What sort of reaction did that get?
Yes, that's right, Adam. It's from the Climate Change Committee. This is a UK body that oversees the governments of the UK and the targets that they're attempting to meet. Now, this week they said that Scotland had lost its lead over the rest of the UK in trying to tackle climate change. Scotland has often been described as having world-leading climate targets, but the committee said that progress had unfortunately largely stalled. So the Conservatives seized on that report in Parliament and they said, well, what more can the Scottish Government actually do?
It's this government which has the powers to take action on decarbonising buildings, transport and farming, but they have not used them. So responsibility for these failures lies squarely at their door, no matter how much the Cabinet Secretary tries to suggest otherwise. But since the Cabinet Secretary brought it up, let's examine decarbonising heat in buildings. Cabinet Secretary, in the context of a £2 billion underspend and the biggest financial settlement in the history of devolution, can the Cabinet Secretary tell us how cutting £37 million from the Energy Efficiency Capital Grants budget and £45 million from the Heat and Buildings Capital Grants budget will help achieve the targets so catastrophically missed?
The member made reference specifically to the issue around decarbonisation of domestic premises. So there's a number of factors that are important in relation to that, one of which is the decarbonisation of our natural gas system. As yet, it's unclear, because the UK government control that, exactly when that's going to happen, right? Which is but it's important. No, it's an important issue which we are keen to resolve with them, so we have clarity, because that then informs the investments we make in helping to support the decarbonisation of people's domestic heating systems. So we need to have that alignment, and as the member will recognise, one of the key recommendations that came from this report is the need for greater cooperation between the UK Government and the Scottish Government, and that's why we have been asking for clarity on this, so we can ensure that the £1.8 billion that we are investing in this parliamentary term alone, which is record investment into decarbonising domestic premises, is used in the most efficient, effective way.
The Minister there defending the government's record, and Adam, it's all the more interesting here at Holyrood because the Greens are in government with the SNP, of course, and the Greens say the report sets out the scale of the challenge that we all need to face up to. They claim they have made changes in government here in Scotland, such as a ban on new coal mines, something the UK government hasn't done. Adam.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was Andrew Kerr there at the Scottish Parliament. Right, let's come back to Westminster and catch up again with Susan Hume. Now, Susan, there's been a long-running debate about whether there should be this new coal mine in Cumbria at Whitehaven. And this week, the government finally gave its verdict.
Yes, and it's to go ahead. It's funny because I wrote coal at the start of my notes. And it felt like a real blast from the past because this is the first new coal mine for 30 years. Now, this isn't coal for burning to make electricity as we used to have it in the old days. This is coking coal for use in the steel-making industry. Now, the Minister, Michael Gove, says it's going to bring jobs to the area, that it's not going to damage wildlife and that the plant itself is carbon neutral. That's not taking into account what happens to the coal afterwards, mind you. It's very popular with those northern Redwall Tories. They really liked it. But as you can imagine, the critics said this is the last thing you need to be doing in a climate emergency.
I think it is important to restate, as I think is well understood, that the proposal granted permission yesterday for the production of coking coal for use in steel production. It is not an energy proposal. Our net zero strategy makes it clear that coal has no part to play in future power generation, which is why we're phasing it out of our electricity supply by 2024. And coal's share of our electricity supply has already declined significantly in recent years. It was almost 40% of our energy supply in 2012. It is now less than 2% in 2020.
I have one question for the Secretary of State today. What on earth is he thinking? The decision to greenlight the reopening of the Woodhouse Colliery is bad. It's bad policy and it's bad politics. It is the latest in a string of absurd decisions from a government in chaos, causing chaos in this chamber and causing chaos out there in the country, in office but not in power. This mine will produce coking coal used for steel, not for electricity generation. So as he has had to admit today, to claim it helps safeguard our energy security is a nonsense. But the reality is that this mine is projected to increase emissions by 0.4 million tonnes a year, and that's from his own advisers in government. It is the equivalent of putting 200,000 more cars on the road every single year.
We will need steel for decades to come, including in the renewables sector. How else do we ensure that we supply all of the ingredients necessary for onshore wind and for other renewable energy materials without the use of steel? If the Honourable Lady or anyone else in this House has an answer, I and millions of scientists would love to hear it.
Would the Minister agree with me that where we have indigenous resources which this economy needs, it's economically better and more honest to use those rather than import from countries with lower environmental standards and also may not be able to rely upon? But does he not find it ironic that some of those who are complaining today are the first to complain about not doing enough for poorer regions of this country, and also would be the first in line to complain if steel jobs were lost?
Secretary of State.
Well, as ever, my honourable friend makes his case very eloquently, and he is quite right to point out that the inspector gives appropriate weight to the high-skilled, high-quality jobs that will be created as a result of this development going ahead.
His colleague, the former COP26 president, described this decision as an own goal. So can I ask the Secretary of State whether he thinks approving a new coal mine in the middle of a climate crisis will enhance or damage Britain's reputation as a global green leader?
I should point out that in paragraph 21.163 of the Inspector's report, he specifically addresses the question of biodiversity and says that he is satisfied that the supplemental undertaking given by the applicant would ensure that the proposed development would provide for a minimum net gain in biodiversity of 10% prior to the commencement of production and a further net gain to be achieved on restoration. So the Inspector took account of biodiversity in coming to his judgment, and so have I.
We also got an important piece of legislation debated in the House of Commons this week. It's the Online Safety Bill, which is the government's plans to regulate social media and technology companies. How did that go?
Yeah, there we go, from digging up coal out of the ground to new technology. The Online Safety Bill is the MPs is the government's attempt to try and regulate this huge new world of the internet and of social media and of the harms that it can create. Indeed, in the public gallery, there were the families of some children who've been harmed or indeed died as a result of things they'd seen online. However, the government has come under a bit of pressure from its own side over preserving free speech. So they want to make changes to their own bill to get rid of bits which would make online companies have to take down content that isn't illegal but is harmful. They think that for adults at least, that should still be allowed. Opposition isn't happy about that. They think that's the wrong way to go. They also think the government has generally made a bit of heavy weather about the bill altogether, and that is going to slow it down even longer when we need the laws now.
Children are at the very heart of this piece of legislation. Parents, teachers, siblings and carers will be looking carefully at today's proceedings. So for all those who are watching, let me be clear. Not only have we kept every single protection for children intact, we have worked with children's organisations and parents to create new measures to protect children. Platforms will still have to shield children and young people from both illegal content and a whole range of other harmful content, including pornography and violent content, etc. But they will also face new duties on age limits. No longer will social media companies be able to claim to ban users under 13, whilst quietly turning a blind eye to the estimated 1.6 million children who use their sites underage.
Disinformation, abuse, incel gangs, body shaming, COVID and Holocaust denial, scammers, the list goes on. All actively encouraged by unregulated engagement algorithms and business models which reward sensational, extreme, controversial and abusive behaviour. It is these powers and models which need regulating. For individuals on the end of harm, but also harms to society, democracy and our economy. And simply holding platforms to account for their own terms and conditions, as the Secretary of State has just said today, which we've seen just this week at Twitter, can be rewritten or changed at whim. This is not going to be robust enough regulation to deal with the threat that these platforms present.
Together, we must work to get this bill on the statute book as soon as possible by making sure that this historic piece of legislation does get the proper scrutiny that it deserves, so that we can start protecting children and young people online while also empowering adults. Because for too long, the fierce debate surrounding this bill has been framed under an assumption that protecting children online must come at the expense of free speech for adults. Today, Mr Deputy Speaker, we can put an end to this dispute for once and for all.
So what happens next with that legislation then?
Well, the government slipped in another stage in the Commons, then it's got to go to the Lords. They do need to crack on, though, because if it's not law before about next May, it falls and they have to start all over again.
Thank you very much, Susan. Stay where you are. But now let's go to the Welsh Parliament and speak to our reporter, Tulare Glyn-Jones. Hello there. We've been talking here at Westminster about Labour's big plans for the future of the UK Constitution. That was a big story. What was the reaction to all of that in Wales?
Well, the report didn't actually say that much about Wales, but it did call for the devolution of probation and the youth justice system. And that doesn't actually go as far as the Welsh Labour government's stance here in Wales. They want to see policing and the whole of the criminal justice system devolved to Wales. So it didn't really back up their position at all. And I think it will be really disappointing to many in Welsh Labour and that more pro-devolution camp who kind of took for granted that a UK Labour government sympathetic to devolution would automatically bring about the structural change that they say is needed to better govern Wales. But they're putting on a brave face, saying that the door is still open because there's a second commission into the Constitution of Wales, which has been commissioned by the Welsh Labour government.
UK Labour now only proposes to devolve powers over youth justice and the probation services to the Welsh Government. How do you therefore respond to this? And do you agree, I think I can judge the answer, it's a rhetorical question, but do you agree that this now puts to bed the wider devolution of justice and policing to Wales?
The report makes it absolutely clear that there are no doors closed, that the basis of further devolution should be based on subsidiarity. That is, it is only those items that are necessary in terms of the interdependence governance within the UK as a whole that should be dealt with by UK government, and the rest should be devolved. So it does represent a very significant transfer, and I don't believe it says what you're suggesting at all about justice, and I'm confident in the inevitable devolution of justice to Wales.
So that second report I was mentioning earlier is being written by Professor Laura McAllister of Cardiff University and Dr Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. They actually delivered their interim findings this week, and they came to the conclusion that the status quo isn't sustainable, and they've offered three different options. The first being entrenching the current settlement, the second a federal system, and thirdly independence. So constitutional geeks in the Bay, and there are many of us, have had an early Christmas present this week.
Well, another early Christmas present for the geeks, your words, not mine, has been the census, and in particular what it revealed about the number of Welsh speakers that there are.
Yeah, there's been a drop in the number of Welsh speakers from 562,000 10 years ago to 538,000 last year, a 1.7% drop in a decade, with the biggest fall being in the number of children being able to speak the language. And of course, beyond the obvious cultural impact that has, there's a political context here as well, because one of the main objectives of this Welsh government is to double almost the number of speakers to 1 million by 2050. So Mark Drakeford responded to the figures, or tried to explain them, saying that there are fewer children being born, and of course the census was taken during the impact of the pandemic, which had an impact on education, including Welsh language education. And Plaid Cymru has responded, saying that this means that there should be universally compulsory Welsh language education. But that's something Mark Drakeford robustly rebuffed.
Don't we now need to recognise that the actions are not sufficient to reach the target by 2050? As with climate change, goodwill is not the same as delivering against targets. So wouldn't the most positive response to today's news be to ensure that the Welsh Education Bill, which is proposed, which would provide Welsh medium education for all children in Wales within a clear and adequate timetable?
He's offered one solution this afternoon. It's a solution which my party will not adopt. Let me be clear as I can with him about that. Compulsory education for everybody through the medium of Welsh is not the answer to the Welsh language in Wales. It will alienate people who are sympathetic to the Welsh language. It will set the language backwards, not forwards. Now, you are perfectly entitled to make that your policy if you like, but I'm clear with you, as clear as I can, it will not be the policy of the Welsh Government.
And finally from Wales, in First Minister's questions, the Conservatives asked Mark Drakeford about the performance of the NHS in Wales. What happened?
Yeah, I feel this is a perennial topic in my contributions to this programme. So this week it was in response to a BBC Wales story that said the wolf was at the door of the Welsh NHS. They were comments by the BMA Cumbria chair, Dr Iona Collins, who said she doesn't see how things can get any worse. Andrew Arty-Davies, the leader of the Welsh Conservatives, asked the First Minister what he was going to do about that.
After many years of trying to seek improvement in this particular area and be told there's a plan in place, what confidence can you give us that the Welsh Government do have a serious workforce plan in place to address not just the A&E deficit of emergency medicine baseline figures, but across the whole NHS here in Wales, which even now the profession, as you said, have bravely come forward to highlight today?
While it is true that work patterns are changing and people are choosing to work fewer hours than they once did, even when you take that into account, there is a very significant rise in the number of people working in the Welsh NHS. As to the future, the only way that you can offer a sustainable solution to the Welsh NHS staffing is by investing in the training of people for the future. And everywhere in the Welsh NHS, we are training more people today than ever before.
So it's been a really busy week here at the Welsh Parliament. We've barely scratched the surface and plenty more next week. We've got the Welsh Government's budget being published on Tuesday, so plenty for us Baywatchers to get our teeth into.
Thank you, Tulare. That was Tulare Glyn-Jones at the Welsh Parliament. Now, Susan, we haven't been able to go to the Northern Ireland Assembly for months and months on this programme now because there hasn't been a Northern Ireland Assembly because it is suspended. But we heard in the headlines that there was an attempt to kind of change that situation this week. How did that go?
Yeah, they turned the heating on briefly at Stormont and they did meet to try and elect a speaker, which is the first thing they have to do to get the Assembly back and running. However, the DUP is boycotting both the Assembly and power sharing in government as well. They say because they're protesting against that Northern Ireland protocol. Comes up practically every week, I think, and that is the post-Brexit trading arrangements that they particularly hate. There was an attempt at Westminster, well, not an attempt, it actually worked. They passed a law at Westminster trying to hold their feet to the fire. So that would postpone elections to give more time for a deal, but also to cut the pay of Assembly members while they're not working and concentrate minds.
So the Secretary of State has now brought the Executive Formation Bill through Westminster to extend the deadline to form a government or to hold an election. He's now given decision makers to civil servants and he has cut MLA pay. He has set out a budget statement and will bring forward an unadulterated Tory budget bill also. And whilst they're spending all this time trying to find workarounds, the real question is, how are they using the space that they have now created to get a negotiated settlement with the EU to restore the executive and put to the test the DUP's boycott? We do not have months to ponder but rather weeks to take action that creates stability and certainty for society, businesses and politics. We cannot be left to the mercy of the Tories in London, people who are dictating the priorities here when they have no votes and no mandate here.
The recall of this Assembly is nothing more than a farce. We know that it is a stunt, the public know that it is a stunt, and the other parties know that it is a stunt as well, because many of them have told us so privately. And so it should come as no surprise to the House that the DUP will not be supporting either of the nominees for Speaker today. It does provide us with one useful benefit. It provides us once more with the opportunity to say clearly to the Government and the European Union that this issue must be resolved. Threatening an election doesn't change anything, cutting salaries doesn't change anything, but what will unlock devolution is getting the protocol sorted, restoring Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market and removing the democratic deficit. When that happens, we will not be found wanting. We will elect a Speaker and we will nominate ministers. So we say to the UK and the EU, the ball is in your court, the clock is ticking, get on with it.
OK, so we've heard a few references in the last few minutes to this legislation, which is actually called the Executive Formation Bill, and that was in the Lords this week.
Yeah, that's right. So they passed it. That was the last stage in Parliament. And as I was saying, that postpones the elections to try and give some time for the Northern Ireland Protocol to be all sorted out. And that should allow the DUP to go back into power sharing. There was a lot of scepticism in the Lords about whether that would really work.
It is, I think, clear to most, though, that a further election in the immediate term would be unlikely to produce a significantly different result or resolve the situation that we currently face. The time, therefore, has come for the Government and indeed noble lords in this House to take action in response to what can best be described as the governance gap that has emerged in Northern Ireland, and that is what the Government's bill seeks to do. The bill, though, is not, and I cannot stress this enough, intended to be a long-term solution to the issues Northern Ireland is facing.
I honestly think that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland does not understand the politics or politicians in Northern Ireland. He and his colleagues seem to think by threatening an election or reducing Assembly members' salaries or preventing the payment of the energy monies that somehow politicians will be brought to heel. An examination of the history and politics in Northern Ireland will show that this will not happen.
This is going to be solved by decisions made either here in this House through legislation or by talks between the European Union and the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not against having an input from Northern Ireland parties, but it's not going to be solved by Northern Ireland parties sitting down together because they can't effect the changes that are needed. And that's just a fact of life.
If there was a functioning executive, they wouldn't have been let out. They would have talked about it. They would have dealt with these issues. And I still think there's an opportunity for that to happen. But they can't do it in 7 weeks. That's absolutely the case. Frankly, I think it's a bit daft put in a deadline of 7 weeks there. I just don't understand the logic behind it at all. The great danger in Northern Ireland is always drift. You can drift into violence. You can drift into a vacuum. You can drift into a position where nobody wants the institutions anymore because it's all too difficult. And we all go back into our respective corners. That's not the answer.
Now, Susan, before I let you go, what has Parliament got lined up for us next week?
Well, it's not quite the last week before Christmas, but it will be the last Prime Minister's question time. So that will be the high point. Of course, I always think that the most interesting things in every parliamentary week are the ones that I can't tell you about now. They're the things that come up, but they're getting very good at reacting to stuff that happens in the day. The Speaker asks for those urgent statements, and those are the things really to look out for.
Thank you very much. Thanks for helping us point them out, Susan. Thank you. Right, that's all for Politics UK for this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and also available afterwards on iPlayer. Have a good weekend. Bye.